Good afternoon, everybody, and all the senior scientists here and all those who are online for this lecture. My apologies for reaching late. My talk is going to be about the societal impact of the chemical industry. And whenever a new student joins the chemical field, one of the first reactions that parents have is of worry. That chemical industry means probably a problem, probably pollution, and so on and so forth. So very often the first job that we have to do, even when we go to colleges and schools, is to show the positive side of being a chemical professional. But here I'm going to talk about the impact that the chemical sciences and chemical engineering has had on the society over the centuries. I will begin with just saying the place that I come from. Next, please. I come from this Institute of Chemical Technology, which caters only to chemical technology related fields. Next, please. Established in 1933, we have 9 branches for undergraduate education. But besides the bachelors, we have about 700 doctoral students with us and 550 postgraduate students with us. We have a large number of publications, and yet we are connected very closely to the industry. A large number of our people end up becoming entrepreneurs, many of them being first generation also. And some 19 Padma awardees have been our alumni or faculty members put together. And when the Confederate of Indian Industry started this Best Industry Related Institute Award, all the 4 years consistently it's been this institute. So these are the shoulders that I get to stand upon when I give the talk. Next, please. Talk about the history. Human evolution has so many examples where mankind has won over nature, or at least been able to put things under control. And it is the brain's capacity that distinguishes man from other animals. No other animal has divided the world into India or Europe or whatever. It's only the mankind, and that's because of the brain. No other living being has been able to match that. Next. Yes, anybody asks what is the earliest invention that mankind had? Fire. And we must realize that at that time things were not called even science, but the early man realized that it takes air for combustion to happen. It takes some material. Stone cannot burn, but wood can burn. This was the early knowledge of chemistry that man developed and used for all this time. So that is the primary invention for any human life if we want to look at. Next. Clothing and shelter, the primary needs, are very closely linked to the materials industry and the chemical industry. For a long time, man was dependent only on collected food, which was to be fruits and vegetables only, and birds could eat grains, man could not. It was because of the discovery of fire that man could cook food, depolymerize it, and hydrolyze the material into a digestible form. Now, only these words were not talked of when this was done, but it has been done all along till now. But that is the process of converting the food grains that we know today into a digestible food. But that also meant that instead of depending on collected food, man started depending on self-developed or self-grown food, the organized farming. And with organized farming, a few other things also happened. Next slide. One of the things was that when organized farm I developed, and he is the stronger person at the end of those 4-month cycle, he can take that food away from me and I will have to simply watch. So I require weapons, I require protection. So the systems of the society which developed for protection, for kingdoms, for armies, all was originated because of farming as the activity. But for that, if mankind was purely dependent on the stone weapons, things would be different. But imagine that some part of the world, they develop a particular kind of chula from a particular kind of red mud, where after a few years of operation, it becomes malleable and it can be given a shape into of a weapon. When this invention came forth, that must have changed life for that country of that region beyond imagination. And this knowledge must have been kept a secret for centuries together, because you don't want to give this knowledge to your neighboring enemy who will fight with you. So this must have been one of the earliest intellectual property protection that happened, that metallurgy was developed believably either in India or China or one of these parts of the country, and then it went as the Damascus sword and then to the western part of the world. But metal making and metallurgy is also a form of chemical manufacture. Next. The wheel, of course, changed the things altogether, but even in the modern vehicles, if you see, a few more developments caused by the chemical industry are important. Had it been purely metals, your car would have weighed more than twice of the car weight today. The engineering polymers that get used in creating a vehicle today make it lightweight and therefore much more usable. Next. Food, clothing, and shelter. And in food, it's not just the organized farming tools, but the use of synthetic fertilizers and better varieties of crops, which all comes with this kind of research and we use extensively today. Next. Dependent only on cotton and wool as the natural fibers available, half of us would have been without clothing. It is only because Carothers developed accidentally a molecule called the polyester, which we use today so much for making clothes, that all of us wear clothes. Most of us, people even senior than me, would remember as you grew up, probably 3 of your siblings had one cupboard. Today, every single child in urban societies has one cupboard. So per head use of the fiber material has also probably tripled, and coupled with the population growth, and that would not have been possible had it not been for this synthetic polymeric materials. Next. If mankind was not having a material called cement, we would still be living in the caves and wooden houses. It is cement as an industry that allows us to build all these buildings where we can live today. So the cement as a material industry is responsible for the shelter part. Next. And another very remarkable feature is that none of these developments happened for improving the quality of life of mankind. They didn't happen for the luxuries of mankind. Most of these originated out of wars or requirement of wars, which then led to a peacetime use of most of these things. And in the more recent history, it is the Cold War and the space competition that led to a lot of inventions in the world in the materials and chemical industry. Next. War-related research, invention of this particular polymer nylon happened in a very interesting manner. Again, the same name Carothers, he is credited for the invention about making nylon, but it was because in the Second World War, aeroplanes had become very common in use. Many of you have probably seen movies like Saving Private Ryan or the Attack on Normandy, the Longest Day, and so on, where we get to see the usage of paratroopers being dropped at that place. So it was a very, very significant contribution at the end of the Second World War. And the biggest problem that paratroopers used to face before that is that a significant number of the paratroopers will die before they land because the rope would break. And the rope used to be a cotton rope. And to have better strength rope was the first usage for nylon, which was developed around the Second World War time. But post-war, the biggest use was actually for nylon stockings for women in Europe who would wear skirts and will want cold protection. So instead of thick woolen stockings, nylon stockings that you would see in the internet, find photographs of people queuing up as ration lines, like my generation has seen earlier days for food in India, rationing of nylon material to European people for making those stockings. And later, of course, it's used as an industrial component in every possible way. So development happened originally because of the war. Next. Another example of war-related research. By the end of 19th century, it was thought world over that every piece of land that could be brought under cultivation has already been brought. And no more forest can be broken down to make it into an agricultural land. In fact, these days you see a bigger pressure of land under agriculture being converted to NA for residential purposes. So at that time, it was thought that the maximum production of food that world can have has reached, and if the population grows even 25% beyond what it was at the end of the 19th century, there will be starvation. Indeed, it used to be a fairly hand-to-mouth situation at that time, that if there is a drought, it would mean shortage of food throughout the world. More so, probably even in our Sujalam Supalam country, India, because population growth was becoming more than what the land could sustain. And what made a big change there is once again the war, the First World War. In the First World War, Germany required bombs, which were made out of trinitrotoluene, which needed nitric acid. And the only way nitric acid was then made was sulfuric acid reacting with a salt, chili saltpeter, sodium nitrate, potassium nitrate. Sulfuric acid also was back then made by chamber process, unlike the today's contact process. But the chili saltpeter, potassium nitrate, sodium nitrate, these salts, fortunately or unfortunately, nature or God is not a socialist and it is not distributed over all the countries uniformly. And Germany did not have these salts available to them. And naturally, their enemy countries are not going to sell that material to them to make the bombs. So a big push was for making synthetic nitric acid. And it was known that ammonia can be reacted with air under certain catalytic conditions to make nitrogen oxides, which when absorbed in water become nitric acid. However, the problem was ammonia was obtained from onions or from urine, which would mean a total minuscule source of making that ammonia. And a pair of scientists who stood up to that challenge, one chemist, Fritz Haber, and a chemical engineer. The chemical engineers as a breed came towards the beginning of 20th century or end of 19th century. So till that time, the word chemical engineering was not even heard of. But Karl Bosch was a chemical engineer who for the first time in the world made plants to work at 100, 200 atmospheres along with the testing and the safety of it and so on to manufacture large scale ammonia, which was then used for nitric acid in the World War. But post-World War, that became the biggest way of supplying the most required nutrient to Earth, namely nitrogen, in the form of ammonium and other fertilizers, so that the same land under cultivation could then produce 4 to 5 times more food. So if population is surviving today, you and me are surviving today, it is because of that singular contribution by Haber and Bosch. In 1916, they got the Nobel Prize for it, that synthetic ammonia became possible and the same land can now produce 4 or 5 times. In fact, this didn't happen immediately in India. Next. You see, in 1950s, our food grain production was barely 50 million tons. And it meant that every time there will be a drought, it will create a famine in the country. And in the 1960s, early 1960s, there was 3 consecutive years of such drought. And people from my, maybe not even parents, grandparents area period would know that it was a very bad situation. And we were dependent on food aid by the world, wheat supplied under PL 480 to India was actually something which was considered unfit for human consumption, fed to pigs in the United States, was eaten by my ancestors at that time for survival. Very humiliating situation. The Prime Minister then made one appeal to all the people that if people have fast 1 day per week, 15% shortage can be overcome. And many people started this fast, they called it the Shastri Somvar. And many of them took a vow that they will not stop this Shastri Somvar till the time comes that India gives food aid to United States. And the time indeed came that the country which was dependent on food aid with 50 million metric tons production, by 2000, the same land under cultivation was producing 200 metric tons. And today, if you see in the next slide, today it is 1380 million population, 292 million metric tons production. And next slide, you can see that we are #1 producers of rice in terms of area, #2 in terms of production for wheat as well, #1 in production of pulses, groundnuts, tea, and #2 in many other foods materials. Now, this transformation of a country which was dependent on that big given under PL 480 to a country which today supplies all of these materials to the rest of the world happened because of just two words that we learn in school education, the Green Revolution, Harit Kranti. And which means the contribution by all those IPCOs, CRIPCOs, RCF and everything that we started as fertilizer manufacturing companies and agrochemicals like pesticides. No doubt overuse of fertilizers is bad. No doubt wrong use of a pesticide can cause a problem. But had it not been for these materials, that production, which was less than a fourth at that time, and today's population of India compared to them being 4 times, you can imagine what the situation would have been. So that is the contribution that chemical industry has made to India. And next. Right. About this, there is another thing I would like to mention. This uranium and war-related research making the nuclear bomb gave rise to nuclear energy. And India also started using nuclear energy after Homi Bhabha started his activities in 1962, BARC was formed and so on. But in 1972, India decided to explode nuclear bomb, Pokhran 1. And that meant the entire world started looking at India with suspicion and stopped supplying anything required for nuclear work. And that included one of the very required materials for slowing down neutrons in the energy production aspect as well, namely heavy water. The countries like Australia, France, Canada, which were supplying heavy water to us, said that India is now going to make nuclear bombs, so we stopped giving it. All our nuclear research and the nuclear energy plants came to a grinding halt for that reason. The Prime Minister, once again, at that time, Indira Gandhi, appealed to the atomic energy that heavy water board should find a way of making this heavy water. Now, heavy water is a part of normal water that we drink from that bottle, but at a concentration of 140 parts per million. So if I want to make a pure heavy water, it is 7,000 times purification that I have to do. And purification is normally done by distillation, which depends on difference in properties of materials. But hydrogen and deuterium are isotopes. So properties are hardly any different. So the relative volatility here is of the order of 1.003. Very difficult distillation and one of the highest distillation ratio from 140 ppm to pure. No doubt, no wonder that India did not have the technology back then. But then Heavy Water Board rose to the challenge. They found that ammonia reaction, which has recycle of hydrogen, has a preference for hydrogen over deuterium, and as a result, when the recycle happens several times, it accumulates deuterium there. And instead of starting with 140 ppm, even if we can start with 1000 ppm, it means we are already saving 7-fold of the cost of manufacturing that heavy water. India started manufacturing its own heavy water, became self-sufficient, started exporting. Today, India is the largest exporter of heavy water in the world. And the same countries, Canada, France, Australia, are probably interested in buying our technology from us, developed by Indian scientists, engine engineers in our country. So these are the kind of contributions that we must all be aware that has changed the world and made a difference to our country as well. Next. There was a time where the whole world was actually buying dyes only from India. The Naukhali Satyagraha that we read about, it was because of the Neil which was being exported from India. But then Germany developed synthetic dyes. We were under British rule and German dyes then started ruling the entire picture. But post Second World War, The entire knowledge that the German scientists had was taken out at gunpoint through BIOS and CIOS reports and became available to the entire world. And once again, India, which was already independent by that time, started a dye strip industry. And today, once again, we are one of the largest exporters of dyes. Most of us who use colored clothes would realize the value of it. Otherwise, all of you would be wearing white shirt like I do, and then no colors. I mean, probably men folk may not mind that so much, but I'm sure the women folk would find the word very drab without that. So it's a cycle of manufacture. Today, India is once again at fairly the top position. Next. Another aspect is that one thing common man does not realize is that a chemical industry usually sells its products to another chemical industry. Very few times you will be selling it to the consumer product. You use a toothbrush, but you don't realize that the handle is made of a particular polymer made by one company, the monomer of which it is made by yet another company, the bristles is yet another polymer, the toothpaste that you use, the calcium phosphate in it, the glycerol in it, the sodium lauryl sulfate in it, each made by different companies which sell it to that company. But as a common man, you buy only the final consumer product. And similarly over here, when you want the ammonium nitrate fertilizer or the phosphate fertilizer, there is a chain of plants. And very often I have heard people saying, why is this ammonia plant here? Why is this nitric acid plant here? It should not be there. They should not be allowed to make such chemicals. But they all want the phosphate. They all want the urea. They all want the ammonium nitrate. Or in the next slide, I might have something about medicinal molecule as well. No. A medicine like paracetamol, if I am making, I will need the making of aniline or phenol and all that benzene, toluene, all that linkage. Each chemical industry making those is required. But I will say, if I say that that chemical industry should not be there and paracetamol I should always get, that cannot happen. So when you buy a final product, there is a chain of various industries which are involved in producing it. I already mentioned about cement and its contribution. So let's go ahead. Yeah, here. The war on diseases would not have been successful had it not been for these drugs. So I mentioned paracetamol. Petroleum is required to make benzene, to even benzene. When it is made from petroleum, you are separating sulfur from it, and sulfur makes the sulfuric acid, which is required for several processes. The nitration requires sulfuric acid along with the nitric acid to make that nitrobenzene, which is converted to aniline, which is converted to acetanilide, which is converted to paracetamol. The idea here is not talking about the chemistry aspect, but the part that each of those chemicals are made by different plants and perhaps even different companies. And unless all that chain is in place, you would have problem with getting that paracetamol. If you say that this particular chemical should not be made in India and we can import it from China because it is cheaper, and one day China decides to have another Doklam problem and stop supplying that material. In fact, that happened for metformin. Those of you who are diabetic, you take metformin and the metformin intermediate came from China. And there was a scare at that point of time that India will run out of all the metformin. It didn't fortunately happen because some people immediately started manufacturing, going back to their earlier manufacturing methods. So therefore, the linkage of different materials must be remembered. Next. Energy as a frontier is what we are facing today. The same problem was faced at the end of the 19th century also. There was an article in New York Times that the vehicular traffic in New York has become so high that the pollution caused by that vehicular traffic is unmanageable. I'm talking about end of 19th century. What kind of vehicular traffic I'm talking about? It was horse carts. When horse carts go around, horse excreta falls everywhere. Those of you who have visited Matharan would remember the smell all around with horse excreta, which is not even biodegradable like a cattle excreta can be used for doing something. Horse excreta can't be treated that way as well. And that lying around in the city all over meant a huge smell issue. And that pollution problem was solved when electric cars first came in the beginning of 20th century, and later diesel and petrol engine came and those cars started running. It solved a pollution problem. Today, the number of usage of those cars has gone up so much that we of course feel that that is causing a pollution. But if therefore we go back to natural and say that, okay, we are going to use horse carts, you can imagine what will happen. How many fold the transportation has increased from time of 1900 to 2020. And so natural is not always the solution. And what we think is a pollution problem today was a solution to some problem at that point of time. These plastic chairs, you might say that at the end of this life, if I throw them away, they are not going to decay and they stay for 1,000 years and it's a problem. But had it not been for that, how many trees would have to be cut down to make those wooden chairs? So each of the things that we feel today is a problem is actually a solution to a problem faced by an earlier generation. Had it not been for cars, most of these people would not have been able to come from Mumbai to, or wherever you have come to this place, which means transportation and its consequence of carbon dioxide is a problem, no doubt. But at the scale at which it was made, it was a solution to the problem that otherwise I would have had to waste a week if I had to come from Mumbai to here to give a talk. Like I started in the morning and I am already here, was unthinkable at that point of time. I'm sure some of you have traveled with those ferries and having to cross several bridges where the bridges were not there and so on. So solution to a problem which we face today is not going back, but you have to find the next solution. But all that comes from the material industry, remember that. Next. Look at the energy options. Renewable energy is what we are talking about today. Next. Several options for making electrical, maybe coal, maybe natural gas, hydroelectric, nuclear, but all of them have problems associated with individually. Let's see the next one. If you look at the carbon cycle, you would realize what I'm saying. I think I should skip some slides. Go ahead. Okay, this is something I would mention. The 1 liter of gasoline or petrol that we use today used to be plants at some point of time. So that means that is also renewable fuel. Yes, but only thing is 1 liter of petrol today used to be 20 tons of plant material million years ago. So the time scale as well as the scale of the material realized of conversion of 20 tons of plants plus million years giving you that 1 liter of gasoline. So obviously the fossil fuels are limited availability, not distributed in all the countries as you want. Plus the biggest pollution problem in the country today or the world today, people will say is carbon dioxide, global warming, climate change. But that contribution comes from two major sources, almost 50% from vehicular emission and the remaining 50% from coal consumption for making electricity. All of those, in fact, the vehicular emission of carbon dioxide doesn't happen at the petroleum company. It happens at your and mine car. And the production of electricity which happens at the electrical power plant produces all that carbon dioxide. But unless that electricity was here, there will be no light, there will be no fan, there will be no air conditioning. We cannot function like we do today. But remember this, that every kilowatt hour, every unit of electricity that we use, it pushes 1.6 kilograms of carbon dioxide to atmosphere, 0.2 kgs of ash to atmosphere, and almost 3 liters of potable drinking quality water goes to atmosphere for unit of electricity. Typically in urban India, our consumption is 100 units per person per month, which you can see if your household of 4 or 5 people will have about 400, 500 units consumption, which means annually I'm using 1200 kilowatt hours of electricity just at house, forget even my office. And which means I am putting out almost 1.5 tons of carbon dioxide because of my electricity usage. I am putting 3000 liters of water down into the atmosphere because of my electricity usage. And typical water consumption in an urban India is about 10,000 liters per year. But rural India survives with just 2000 liters per year. Add to that the 3000 liters that I am consuming as an urban household, and you would realize what kind of problem I am talking about. So alternative options are there, but nuclear option, there are always worries that yes, it can be used for weapons as well. What happens if there is an accident? What happens if Fukushima happens? What happens if Chernobyl happens? What happens if there is an actual war attack happening on a nuclear power plant? And on top of it, what happens if I have to close down a nuclear power plant? It will cost me 10 times more to close down the power plant than to set it up. For a coal thermal power plant, I just don't go to the plant from tomorrow. It will shut. It will become, it will get corroded. It will become part of the soil, part of nature in a matter of 5-10 years, but not nuclear plant. So there are worries about that as well. So alternate sources, if we have to look at, they have to be something which is sustainable. Next. And look at this energy consumption. Last 50 years, per capita energy consumption, electrical energy consumption went up from about 1100 kilowatt hours to more than 3000 kilowatt hours. 50 years, it has tripled in the world. And where is India on this? Maybe on the next slide, I'll mention that as well. Go ahead, skip this. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, today is about 1075 kilowatt hours per capita. World average is about 3000. And the Western world tells us about how we should conserve and how we should be green in our operations. And look at what the Western world is doing. USA, 13,400 kilowatt hours per capita. Carbon dioxide emission in India, 1450 kgs carbon dioxide get emitted because of my electricity usage per year. And an average American emits 17,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide per capita. So if at all conservation and greenness and sustainable living is to be taught, it should be by Indians to the Western world and not other way around. Our ways of living has been always much more sustainable than the West. Our about 300 gigawatt electricity, 340, 276 of it comes from fossil fuels. Only about 24, that too in the last few years, has been added in solar form. If you look at, in fact, even Europe, they are wiser than us in this aspect. There almost 80% of all the power addition that happened in Europe over the last couple of years period that I have seen, it has been on solar. And we are the country where solar light is available much more plentiful than those European places. And still we are not doing it adequately. Or even converting agricultural residue into biogas. If country like Sweden can do it successfully, which in fact requires that 10% of that fuel has to be burned to keep that anaerobic digestion at 35 degrees. We in India, to keep something at 35 degrees, we don't have to spend any energy at all. But still we don't do it adequately. And they have very little population and such large consumption. If agricultural residue is to be converted into fuel, in India, we still have adequate agricultural residue. Because typically we have not used plants which are genetically modified. And for 1 kg rice grain, we produce about 5 kg of agricultural residue. So and you and me consume typically 1 kg of all grains put together per week. So 50 kgs per year. So 250 kgs of agricultural residue takes place because of your food consumption personally. And this number doesn't change world over. Even advanced countries, Western countries, typically food consumption cannot change much. But their food energy consumption per capita is so high that conversion of agro residue will not be sufficient for them. Whereas in India, that is indeed a solution which is possible. Next. Next. Skip 3 slides. Keep going on. So in India, if we add electricity through solar, we must realize this, that the population growth is something which you have to keep up with. The world has a population of, let's say, X units. By the time, which was in year 1000, India had crossed it by the time of Battle of Plassey. And world's population in 1350 was crossed by India in 1947. And India's population in the time of Battle of Plassey, the world population at the time of 1757 is crossed by India today. So every 100 years, 200 years, the population is changing drastically, and we have to keep the solutions capable of handling that. Next. If you use solar, just one option I am giving here, it is a very dilute source, but next slide. It will require barely 100 by 100 square kilometer area. And even with 25% use, it will generate 300 gigawatts of electricity. So potentially is there. And there are many applications possible. There are issues like it's only daytime and so on, but it can be handled. Next. If energy frontier was the frontier, I have to tell today's generation, which country will solve it? Let us see that. The country which has most need, an African country with very little electricity need, is not going to solve it. A country which has shortage of that petroleum, A country like Venezuela with plenty of oil and coal, or Saudi Arabia with plenty of oil, coal and money is not going to solve that. A country like United States, which also has plenty of natural gas, is not going to solve it. A country which may have need, let's say a country like Bangladesh may have their need and technological capability to utilize that. But do they have the technological manpower needed to make the development? No. If you look at all these, the only country which actually meets all those requirements in India. So I am expecting that the next generation, which is today's students, in their lifetime are going to solve this problem for the country. We created solutions for our generation, which may have become problem today, but they are to be solved by the next generation, taking it ahead. Next. I will not talk about this. Go to the last slide, which is last slide. So that is what I had to mention as a contribution of the society, the chemical industry towards the society. I hope the listeners, especially the young ones, would find a career in this field exciting and would realize how positive a contribution that society is looking from you through the material science and chemical industry field. Thank you for your attention.